The New York Times, that venerable institution, America's undisputed greatest newspaper and indeed one of the world's most formidable journalistic enterprises, finds itself adrift tonight. Lost. Utterly disoriented. For all its storied history, its Pulitzer Prizes, its profound influence, the New York Times, at this very moment, seems to possess no compass, no viable framework, for comprehending, let alone adequately covering, the sheer unadulterated madness emanating from Donald Trump. And in this bewildering void of understanding, what does it do? It retreats. It actively, conspicuously, and tragically ignores it. This isn't just a journalistic oversight. It feels like a profound, almost instinctual, aversion to confronting an uncomfortable reality. One might even draw a chilling parallel to 1789, when the London Times, faced with the unsettling spectacle of King George III's genuine royal madness, found itself in a similarly awkward position, compelled by the prevailing political climate to look away. This disquiet, this profound disorientation, is by no means confined to the hallowed halls of the New York Times. No, the entire Washington press corps, a collective body supposedly dedicated to holding power accountable, appears to have succumbed to the same malaise, lost in a swirling vortex of unprecedented presidential behavior. Consider for a moment the aspirations of any young bright-eyed journalist currently working at the New York Times. When they were burning the midnight oil editing their high school newspapers, dreaming of one day having their byline grace the pages of the Gray Lady, could they ever, in their wildest imaginings, have conceived of a reality where a President of the United States would weaponize the official social media communication tools of the White House, channels paid for by the American taxpayer, no less, to disseminate fabricated, AI-generated videos? Videos specifically designed to malign and discredit the first black minority leader of the United States House of Representatives and the first Jewish minority leader of the United States Senate? Such a scenario would have been beyond comprehension, and dystopian fever dream utterly alien to the civic ideals they presumably embraced. Indeed, the very notion of a president deploying government-operated social media accounts to craft deepfake videos, indistinguishable from reality thanks to sophisticated AI, putting entirely fabricated words into the mouth of someone like Chuck Schumer, words laced with a distinct, shocking, and profoundly vulgar Trump-style profanity Schumer would never utter publicly, would have been met with outright disbelief. Yet, this is the language, the coarse public obscenity, that has repeatedly brazenly shocked the world when spoken by the current occupant of the Oval Office. Let us be unequivocal. Donald Trump holds the unenviable distinction of being the first president of the United States ever heard publicly and deliberately employing profanity, repeatedly and without apparent compunction. These are words that I could repeat here, but choose not to, precisely because every adult is supposed to understand that there are hallowed spaces, public forums like this, where such language is simply inappropriate. It's a foundational understanding of decorum that, it seems, utterly bypassed Donald Trump's education. And yet, who among us can truly afford to pause and dissect Donald Trump's use of profanity when he is simultaneously deploying federal troops into American cities, brazenly lying about these urban centers being war zones? I concede with a degree of weariness that the use of vulgar language, while deeply troubling, feels almost inconsequential, a mere footnote in the overwhelming daily ledger of Donald Trump's relentless transgressions. But we must never forget, etched into the collective memory of American political discourse, the near-unanimous decree from the American news media that Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign was irrevocably torpedoed because she dared, just once, to utter the word deplorable in reference to a segment of Trump voters. A segment, it should be painstakingly noted, that on January 6th, proved themselves willing to behave in a manner that was not merely deplorable but outright violent, staging an unprecedented assault on the very capital of the United States, all in the name of their presidential candidate, becoming in doing so, the only people in American history to ever undertake such an act. Astonishingly, there are still individuals working within the New York Times today who will earnestly argue that Hillary Clinton's solitary use of the word deplorable was, in and of itself, a deplorable act. These very same individuals, it must be noted, find themselves utterly bereft of commentary, paralyzed into absolute silence, when confronted with Donald Trump's breathtakingly egregious use of language. Not a peep.
Note à single critical outrance.
These are the self-same arbiters of political morality who once asserted, with unwavering conviction, that no individual could possibly ascend to the presidency in this nation if they dared to label any American voters deplorable. And yet, Donald Trump, a man who openly, unapologetically, and chillingly refers to his political opponents as vermin, a word with deeply unsettling historical echoes, particularly its association with Hitler's rhetoric, not only ran for president employing such dehumanizing epithets but was, against all conventional wisdom, elected president after promising to treat American voters who didn't support him like vermin. Now we witness him escalating this tactic, leveraging fake AI-generated audio of Chuck Schumer purporting to declare all Democrats pieces of crap, and yes, I have diplomatically sanitized that particular expletive for this program. Where are those wise pundits now? Those who, for years, lectured us incessantly that Hillary Clinton's political career was doomed the moment she deployed a word like deplorable in a campaign context, even when referring to voters on the opposing side. Their entire argument now hinges on a foundation of intellectual dishonesty, requiring them to completely, willfully, and selectively ignore every single toxic, dehumanizing thing Donald Trump has publicly uttered about voters who do not align with him. Every single thing. It bears remembering that Hillary Clinton's deplorable comment was made during a private fundraiser, a moment of unguarded candor, clearly not intended for widespread public consumption. She was, admittedly, far too relaxed in that setting, uttering something she would never have publicly declared. Donald Trump, by contrast, speaks deliberately, clearly, and directly into microphones, for the entire world to hear, proclaiming that all Democrats are lunatics. That is his word. Lunatics. Donald Trump truly believes that 75 million Americans, who dared to vote for Kamala Harris, are nothing short of lunatics. He has undeniably articulated the most vitriolic, the most ugly sentiments about American voters that any American politician has ever dared to utter in our nation's history. And yet, after spouting these very things, Donald Trump went on to secure the Electoral College. And this precisely is where the New York Times, along with the broader press, simply loses its bearings. It frankly doesn't know how to process, how to grapple with, the sheer volume and audacity of what Donald Trump says and does. I confess, I don't confidently know how to handle it either. Every single day, I feel my way through the thick, viscous mud of Trump's reality, unsure what to legitimately ignore and what demands our urgent attention. But what I do know with absolute certainty is that I must think about it. I must think about it constantly, every single day, confronting the totality of it. And in this precious hour we have on this program, I must make the agonizing decision of which specific corrosive aspects of the Trump poison demand our immediate examination. Tonight, the New York Times and the Washington Press Corps are not merely struggling. They are quite literally drowning in the pervasive deviancy and outright perversity that characterizes Donald Trump and his entire White House. A White House, it must be stressed, where every single individual working within its walls actively supports this deeply perverse weaponization of government-operated social media, a platform used to spew poison, a vehicle for what is undeniably raw insanity born from the darkest recesses of Donald Trump's mind. The White House Press Corps, in its daily encounter with this torrent, has simply succumbed. They are lost within it. They have internalized it. They have, shockingly, fully accepted it. This is the stark, disturbing reality of what the New York Times and the Washington media have demonstrated, particularly this past week. Their acceptance has reached such a critical point that when the New York Times composed its momentous editorial concerning the recent government shutdown, an editorial titled "The Real Stakes of the Shutdown," which purportedly aimed to encapsulate every critical point, they conspicuously omitted any mention whatsoever of what Donald Trump himself did instead of engaging in good faith negotiations. They simply didn't mention it. Here's the content translated into U.S. English, adopting a political register and incorporating the requested stylistic enhancements. They were searching for a viable way out of the shutdown, a path to normalcy, but what they deliberately omitted was a clear, unvarnished account of the president's recent, truly egregious behavior on social media. There was no mention of his digitally affixing a crude sombrero onto the head of Representative Hakeem Jeffries, a blatant act of disrespect bordering on racial caricature. Nor did they highlight his audacious fabrication of quotes, putting deeply profane, utterly awful and frankly monumentally stupid Trump words into the mouth of Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. This wasn't merely an oversight, it was a glaring, almost willful omission. They simply didn't even touch upon it. The existential stakes of this government shutdown, when stripped of all pretense, are nothing less than a brutal confrontation between unadulterated insanity and the dwindling remnants of sanity. And what becomes painfully clear is that the press corps, bound by a seemingly antiquated rulebook, appears utterly ill-equipped to grapple with such a profound, almost philosophical dilemma. The New York Times, in particular, demonstrates a peculiar reluctance, a refusal even, to squarely confront and accurately identify this spiraling madness. They appear unwilling to even describe it for what it truly is. Consider the Times editorial on the shutdown. On the surface, it presents as a meticulously reasoned, impressively clear, and undeniably solid piece of journalism from start to finish. It frames the core dispute as a fundamental disagreement, whether millions of Americans should continue to have vital access to affordable health care. It posits that President Trump is actively attempting to strip away health insurance from countless citizens, while Senate Democrats, with a commendable display of backbone, are steadfastly refusing to simply roll over and acquiesce. This was, in a vacuum, a perfectly lucid and accurate depiction of the stakes involved, before the truly unprecedented outburst of public Trump-fueled insanity began to dominate the political landscape. Yet, the editorial concludes in a style so archetypal, so fundamentally New York Times, it almost feels as if every staffer had mastered it during their high school newspaper days. It reads like a relic from the last century, a voice from a bygone era, long before the sheer untamed madness of Trump became an undeniable, corrosive force within our government. One could easily imagine these very same sentences penned during the Clinton administration, with Bill Clinton in the White House and Newt Gingrich serving as the fiery Speaker of the House, engaged in their own bitter legislative battles. The editorial declares, with an air of solemn duty, that it is incumbent on the President and Congress to reopen the government as soon as possible and commit to preventing Americans from having to pay too much for health insurance next year. It then offers the time-honored, utterly predictable conclusion: the only way forward is to negotiate a compromise. It's time to start talking. How utterly lost is that sentiment? What century, what alternate reality, do they inhabit that would allow them to calmly, dispassionately, type those particular sentences? They could have, with absolute impunity, included that exact phrase in virtually any editorial about any government shutdown, under any other presidency. But to read it now, in this precise political moment, reveals just how profoundly disconnected the Times truly is. It's time to start talking, they suggest.
Talk to whom?
A man who, by all public evidence, vehemently refuses to engage in any substantive dialogue, preferring instead to incessantly post social media videos filled with outright lies and vicious ridicule about those he purports to negotiate with? Talk to him, they urge. But let's be starkly honest. In the entire sprawling history of governance in the United States of America, no one, not a single individual, has ever been forced to attempt dialogue with a person exhibiting such an extraordinary level of unhinged behavior, on any issue ever. And yet the Times, in its detached wisdom, counsels, it's time to start talking. The entire editorial, from its first word to its last, conspicuously fails to carve out even a single sliver of space to acknowledge the sheer, undeniable madness of Donald Trump as a contributing factor in the government shutdown, let alone as an impediment to finding a way out of it. And then, almost as an afterthought, buried within the piece, is what one can only charitably assume is its sole anemic reference to Donald Trump's truly insane social media posting. It describes how he mixed bombastic social media blasts and threats to fire thousands of federal workers if Democrats did not provide the votes for his plan to keep the government open. Bombastic social media blasts. Is that what they are? How exquisitely polite, how utterly sterile. No, they are not merely bombastic. That term diminishes their true nature. They are fundamentally, undeniably insane. In a telling interaction, Democratic Congresswoman Madeleine Dean, seeking a rational path, approached the Republican Speaker of the House to discuss what she candidly termed the Trump madness. Intriguingly, the Speaker appeared to offer a series of subtle nods, a quiet, almost imperceptible gesture of agreement, when Dean articulated her profound concern that Donald Trump is unwell. The president is unhinged. He is unwell, she stated. What kind of response is that from a man in his position? He could have unequivocally stated, "No, the president is not unwell." Perhaps deep down, he even intended to, but the words failed him. Instead, his unspoken agreement, conveyed through those silent nods, was taken as a given in the conversation. He simply nodded when he heard the unsettling diagnosis that the president is unwell. And his immediate, almost instinctive response, delivered while still nodding, was, "A lot of folks on your side are too." The diminutive word "too" there is loaded, a passive indicator of similarity to what had just been stated, implicitly, a similarity to Trump's state of unwellness. The plain, unvarnished interpretation of that exchange is that the speaker was, in effect, tacitly agreeing that Trump is indeed unwell, merely attempting to deflect by suggesting that others also share this unfortunate condition. That, in its essence, was the speaker's rather astonishing defense of Trump's unwellness. He's not the only one. Of course, in his particular context, he very much is the only one that truly matters, but alas. The Republican Speaker of the House, any speaker worth his salt, simply has to be profoundly shocked, even appalled, by the outrageousness of Donald Trump's recent actions on social media. We can deduce, almost with certainty, that he is shocked. But like so many of his Republican colleagues in Washington, he possesses an almost superhuman ability to process that initial shock instantly, immediately understanding the dire political consequences. He knows, with an icy clarity, that he will never ever dare to publicly utter a negative word about it. Why? Because he dedicates every working moment of his political life to the art of being a coward. He has, in effect, taken an implicit oath of subservient cowardice to Donald Trump. He is no longer genuinely the Speaker of the House in the traditional sense. He has devolved into merely the Speaker of Trump in the House. Now, if I were tasked with running the New York Times, which, let's be clear, while I might consider myself competent to do so, I also recognize the immense, almost insurmountable challenges, and I honestly doubt that I could navigate this particular situation any more effectively than they have. I genuinely don't believe I could. Instead, I have the comparatively easier responsibility of an hour of television where I can simply articulate whatever thoughts come to mind, free from the stringent editorial constraints of a major newspaper. That is an infinitely less burdensome responsibility than editing the New York Times. And let me be clear, I have never for a moment presumed that I could do a better job than the New York Times. I have never presumed I could outperform someone stepping up to bat in Yankee Stadium who ultimately strikes out. So it is not from a perch of intellectual superiority that I observe the New York Times having struck out, spectacularly, in the face of the escalating madness of Donald Trump this week, a madness that has, disturbingly, reached new extremes, depths of absurdity we haven't witnessed before, even from Donald Trump himself. The White House staffers, those who are forced to live with the sheer, unvarnished intimacy of Donald Trump's insanity on a daily basis, have clearly, and by all appearances, collectively concluded that it simply cannot be defended. And so their only discernible strategy, their desperate coping mechanism, is to pretend with a straight face that there's nothing remotely crazy about any of it. That's precisely the untenable position Donald Trump's famously faithful vice president attempted to maintain just yesterday. And now, astonishingly, the White House has announced its intent to continue posting that highly problematic video, at taxpayer expense, across official White House communication channels, and to add insult to injury, to make the sombrero bigger every day. That, lamentably, is what the metaphorical children in the White House are apparently going to do. This marks a truly grim historical first, the first president in the first White House who has openly, and apparently without shame decided, much like J.D. Vance did yesterday, that a government shutdown is, somehow, funny. They have collectively decided it's a source of amusement.
JD.
Vance, astonishingly, seems to believe that a government shutdown, with all its human and economic costs, along with his rather tasteless opportunities for jokes and the increasingly ridiculous sombrero imagery, is fundamentally hilarious. What he conspicuously failed to do, however, was explain what precisely is so funny about it. Prior to the seismic upheaval brought about by the Trump White House, indeed, in a political epoch that now feels almost quaint, whenever the specter of a government shutdown, a true national disaster, loomed large, every single individual ensconced within the hallowed halls of the White House approached the situation with a profound and unyielding gravity. This wasn't a time for casual banter or cynical quips. No, there was no need to stifle errant chuckles. The very idea of levity in the face of furloughed federal workers and stalled essential services was anathema. The air itself would thicken with a palpable solemnity, a grim acknowledgment of the immense stakes, irrespective of the particular partisan hue of the president at the helm. And yet, in a stark and profoundly troubling contrast, the escalating crisis of this week's relentlessly flaring madness emanating from the current White House is rendered exponentially more dire by an equally disturbing crisis within the Fourth Estate, specifically, the New York Times and the broader Washington press corps. They appear to be treating this unprecedented chaos as mere business as usual, a tragic and bewildering normalization of the aberrant. Have they, perhaps unwittingly, internalized the very madness they purport to cover, allowing it to subtly recalibrate their journalistic compass? It seems they've tragically lost their intrinsic capacity for genuine shock, for sustained, indignant reaction. Their collective outrage mechanism, once a finely tuned instrument of democratic accountability, appears to be in a deep, almost comatose slumber tonight. However, do not for a moment believe that this vital mechanism is permanently broken. Oh no. Its fury will be instantly, unequivocally revived. Indeed, it will spring to life, firing on all cylinders, the very moment a Democratic candidate for president, or a Democratic president themselves, utters even the slightest, most nuanced negative observation about any segment of American voters, at any time in any place. Isn't it a curious, almost chilling phenomenon? The outrage, seemingly dormant for the current maelstrom, is poised, coiled like a spring, awaiting a Democrat upon whom to unleash its full righteous indignation. Lest anyone accuse this observation of being a partisan broadside, let me be unequivocally clear, this is not an ideological declaration. It is quite simply an observable, undeniable fact that has played out before our very eyes, etched into the public consciousness. Can anyone truly pretend this isn't true? We all vividly recall the relentless, often performative, screaming directed endlessly at Karine Jean-Pierre, Joe Biden's press secretary, a veritable barrage of accusatory questions. We all bore witness to the press corps screaming directly into Joe Biden's face when demanding answers, a level of visceral confrontation that bordered on hostile. And tellingly, we all see with crystal clarity that they do not dare ever do the same, exhibiting that same unbridled aggressive zeal towards the current occupant of the Oval Office or his frequently controversial surrogates.